Hello everybody, it's Sarah, and today it's once again time to talk about what I have read so far in the month of November. Also, I'm sorry for not uploading videos last week, but I really didn't feel like it, like filming, and there's a lot of uni stuff going on currently, so yeah, that was the reason. Anyway, today we're going to talk about what I have read so far in November, as I have already said, and this check-in could be a bit shorter than my usual check-ins because I gotta be honest, I've only finished 4 books so far, which for me is not that much. Usually around this time I have finished at least 6 books, at least this year. And we're going to talk about 5 though, because there was a book that I forgot to talk about in my October wrap-up. So let's start with that book, and that is The Women of Troy by Pat Barker. This is a kind of sequel to The Silence of the Girls, which I read last year and highly enjoyed. The Silence of the Girls follows Briseis, who was Achilles' war prize during the Trojan War. And this is a kind of sequel where we still mostly follow Briseis. This takes off or starts with the sack of Troy, so the moment when the big Trojan horse is brought into the city. And we're not just following Briseis, we first of all get to know the fates of a lot of the women of Troy, hence the name, although we mostly see them through Briseis' eyes. And then every now and again we also get the perspective of, I forgot his name, but basically Achilles' son, who took over the Myrmidons after Achilles' death. Which, by the way, is not a spoiler because the Iliad is like, how old? Over 3,000 years, so, you know, it's not a spoiler. So yeah, what were my thoughts on this? To be honest, mostly it's the thoughts of this was one of those very unnecessary sequels, because I really liked the arc of The Silence of the Girls, which kind of had this concept of Briseis telling the story, but Briseis herself being a very passive character because of the role she has within the Greek camp, and because of being basically a slave, not basically a slave, she is a slave. And so, you know, you have this arc of Briseis telling her story, except it's not really her story, it's Achilles' story. And it kind of continues on here because we do have this perspective of both Briseis as well as Achilles' son not being able to shake off Achilles' legacy. But at the same time, the concept doesn't work as well in this one anymore. Also, Briseis isn't the same type of passive character anymore because her role within the Trojan camp, not the Trojan camp, the Greek camp has changed. And yeah, so I think as a standalone, like this, it doesn't really work to read this without having read The Silence of the Girls. But as a concept, this book is very interesting, except just, you know, The Silence of the Girls was, for me, an excellent book, and the only thing that I didn't like was sometimes the writing style that Pat Barker chose. But this one, it just feels like a cash grab, and it doesn't feel properly thought through. And so, yeah, I still enjoyed it. I'd give it, if I were to rate books this year, which again, I don't, I'd give it probably a solid 3 stars. But yeah, if you enjoyed The Silence of the Girls, I think you can just leave this one and be completely fine. So continuing on with the books that I did read in November, and of course starting with rereads, I reread Sebastian by Anne Bishop. This is the first book in the Ephemera duology / trilogy. It's kind of a duology plus a spin-off. And this duology is set in a world where the world around you, like, it's made up of these different landscapes, and there's dark landscapes and there's light landscapes, and the landscapes are connected to each other by bridges. However, the world around you also is constantly influenced by the people's feelings and heart's wishes and so on. And the only reason why the landscapes don't constantly change is because of women called landscapers, who are basically the anchor for the landscapes to not change, and who are the people telling the landscape, no, you can accept this heart's wish and change your landscape accordingly, or you shouldn't accept this one. And so within this first book, we basically follow two storylines. The first storyline is one that is contained within this book, and that follows Sebastian, who is a half incubus. So he is half demon, half human. And he just, you know, his life is changing. He is kind of unhappy with where his life currently is. And so we follow him as someone comes into his life who might be able to give him his happiness back. And then the other overarching storyline between the first and the second book is that there's this monster that has been caught years and years and years ago, who is the Eater of the Worlds. It's called the Eater of the Worlds, and basically what this monster does is it changes the fears and the nightmares of people in a way that, you know, manifests then within the landscapes and within this world, ephemera. And the Eater of the World seems to be free of its prison once again. So yeah, that's kind of the two storylines that we follow. And yeah, I really enjoyed my reread of this. I think concept-wise, this is one of the most interesting worlds that Anne Bishop built. However, story-wise and character-wise, I think this one is my least favorite of her series. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of got these fantasy romance vibes with Sebastian's storyline, because that one is very romance-focused. But then you have this kind of epic fantasy vibes with the Eater of the World. So I do think Anne Bishop manages to merge those two genres quite well. But yeah, anyway, I enjoyed rereading it. I'm gonna look forward to rereading book 2 and book 3, and then I'm done with my Anne Bishop rereads, which excites me a lot. Then next I have When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain by Nivo. This is the second book in her Singing Hills novella series, I believe it is called, and this was the buddy read for my book club of Queens, Witches and Valkyries, where we read one adult high fantasy written by a woman or genderqueer person per month. Because of that, and because I will upload a review of this, I won't tell you too much. I also won't tell you a lot about the plot, because yeah, it's novellas. If I tell you a lot about the plot, then basically you know everything about the plot. But basically this series of novellas, which by the way you can read out of order, so there's not really that much connecting the different stories, at least the two that we have so far, except that we follow the same main character, who is Chi, and they are basically someone collecting stories. And so I think I enjoyed this one more than the first one, but Nivo is just an incredible writer, and yeah, I just can highly recommend it. And so yeah, gonna be uploading a review for this soon. Next I have another quite short book that's probably more along the lines of a novella than a full novel, and that is Thorn of the Night Blossom by J.C. Kang, which is the first book in the Tales of the Floating World. And in this one we follow half-elf Chia, who is a spy and assassin, but she's currently on assignment in a brothel together with her girlfriend, kind of. And so she has to protect this politician and also uncover some intrigues around him, and that's basically it. That's basically all I want to tell you, because again, this is a very short book as well. But I really enjoyed it. There were some issues I had with the writing style where I'm like, okay, it's, you know, writing-wise, language-wise, not the best book that I ever read. And also it's quite short. We all know I prefer longer stories because there's just more you can do in a longer fantasy story in terms of character building, in terms of world building, and so on. But for a very short story, I highly enjoyed that, and I am definitely interested to continue on with the series and with the author as well. Then the last book that I finished so far this month is probably my biggest disappointment so far this month, and that is Servant of the Empire by Raymond E. Feist and Jenny Wurtz. I read the first book before the summer. I think I read it in June, which was Daughter of the Empire. And I really was surprised by Daughter of the Empire. Basically, this series follows our main character, Mara, who is daughter to this noble house. It's set in a world that is very much inspired by feudal Japan and ancient China as well. And then you have some names that are influenced by, you know, Aztec names or naming conventions. There's a lot of non-Western stuff going on, which in this case I don't mind as much because it was written in the 80s and, you know, there were just different discussions going on in the 80s. So we follow our main character Mara, who is the daughter of this noble family who is supposed to become a priestess. However, when her father and brother die in war or are killed because of intrigues, she has to take over the mantle of leading lady, of head of her family, and has to make sure that first of all her family isn't wiped off the, you know, surface of the earth, but also has to try to get revenge for her brother and father. And so we follow Mara, who's this very interesting character because she does not act rashly. She acts very smartly, and she just manages to maneuver and manipulate the people around her in ways that, the way it's written, I haven't read it in any other book like that ever. By the way, Raymond Feist's name I think is mostly on here because this is set in the same world as his Rift War sagas. So, why am I disappointed by the second book? In the second book, we have the introduction of a new character, a Midcamian, who is basically from one of the countries that Raymond Feist created. And with the creation of this Midcamian, who is Western, and even though he gets hardly any POVs, suddenly the world building becomes very exoticized, but also very barbaric. You know, it's always the question of, you know, actually the good white person, the only white person, has so many troubles with how tradition works within this country because they're also barbaric and, you know, honor bound to kill yourself, and you have slaves and whatever, which, by the way, not to say that nothing that they do isn't quite brutal sometimes, but the way the framing changes everything about the world building that we got so far into something very orientalist and exoticized just really rubbed me the wrong way. And also Mara turned from a very interesting character who knew what to do on her own terms and who made smart decisions on her own terms and from her own experience, into someone who, you know, just takes every advice from this dude, this white dude, and because of that she suddenly wins battles, not because of her own smarts. And instead of someone who is very calculating and very interesting, she turns into a lovesick puppy. And I don't know, it just felt like her entire character was suddenly completely gone, and just, I really didn't like it. And it just there was a lot of upset when I read this book, like a lot of upset. How can the introduction of a single white character suddenly ruin the entire story for me? Which, by the way, isn't to say that white characters are bad or that introducing a white character to this was bad, but, you know, it's kind of strange how just by the introduction of a single white character, you suddenly manage to have the non-white culture be completely othered and exoticized, and that's just really rubbed me the wrong way. That was the books that I finished already, so now let me quickly go through the books I'm currently reading. First, I'm reading Kushiel's Chosen by Jacqueline Carey, which is the second book in Phaedra's trilogy in the Kushiel's Legacy series, kind of. I am a good 2/3 into the book, and yeah, I'm very much enjoying it so far. I think I enjoy the second book more than I did the first one, because the first one had a lot of different storylines, like one after the other, where it then ended up feeling very long. Then next, I am also almost done with John Milton's Paradise Lost. And yeah, it's an epic poem. I don't think I can say I enjoy it or I don't enjoy it. Also, I'm reading this in German, so yeah, it is what it is. I'm reading this to get to my TBR 0. I am also currently reading the second volume of my Arabian Nights or 1001 Nights, also about 2/3 into this, and yeah, not enjoying this too much. I just think, like, with these big fairy tale collections, there's a reason why they sell kind of best of versions, because most of the stories are just like whatever and feel very repetitive. I also started my reread of Oathbringer, and I'm about 300 pages into it, which it doesn't look like I'm 300 pages into it because it's such a long book, but I'm about 1/4 of the way into it, and yeah. It's my Stormlight Archive reread. It's fine. It's my least favorite book by Brandon Sanderson, like in the Cosmere, so it's whatever. I'm gonna get through it to get to Rhythm of War. Then I'm also currently reading a non-fiction, and that is The Brutish Museums, The Bean and Bronzes, Colonial Violence and Cultural Restitution by Dan Hicks. And it's exactly what the title says. This is a book written by one of the curators of the Pitt Rivers Museum, which is one of the biggest ethnological museums in Great Britain. And basically this is, on the one hand, a history of the sack of Benin City in 1897. And on the other hand, it talks about the handling of all the artifacts and the objects that were stolen during this massacre, during this military, what's it called? Not expedition, that was it. I wanted to say exposition, but it's expedition. During this military expedition, and also the framing of having these objects still in museums, and you know, there has been demands for restitutions since decolonization in the 60s. So yeah, I'm about 100 pages into it, so about 1/3 of the way into it. I am currently very much reading the history part of the book, but there's just, like, as you can see, I tapped it quite a bit here at the beginning, which is more of, you know, conceptual part, talking about how we frame these objects. Like, while in between, the author is very much self-congratulatory for writing this and for daring to write this and for daring to call out museums like that. On the other hand, some points are made every now and again. So yeah, just very interesting. And I mean, I'm only 100 pages into it, but so far I think I would recommend it. And then the last book I'm currently reading is, I started my reread of The Mask of Mirrors by M.A. Carrick to prepare for the second book in the Rook and Rose series, The Lie Is Not, at the beginning of December. And I'm also just enjoying this so much. This just, so far, is one of those books that on reread just get better, because there's so many little things I notice now that I didn't notice before, and it's just, it's really good. And I'm taking my time with it because I just want to savor it, and I don't want to be done, you know, 2 weeks before the next book comes out, but just right when I get the second book. So yeah, with all of that said, that was it for my check-in for November. It ended up not being any shorter anyway, because I'm someone who talks a lot. So yeah, with all of that said, if you have any thoughts on any of the books I mentioned, leave them in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. All the links to my social media as well as the book club that I mentioned are linked down below, so go and check those out. I should be uploading the new poll for my book club sometime in the next few days, so look out for that on the Twitter. And yeah, with all of that said, I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!